In today's world, we are increasingly dependent on technology. Our business and personal lives rely on it, but as you've probably noticed, it's unreliable. They promise it'll get better, but it usually gets worse. Our computers are slow, so we end up squinting at smartphones and tablets. We live in constant fear that something's going to happen to our personal data, so we're scared into paying for fake protection that proves useless when disaster strikes. Update attacks, fake Wi-Fi, cloud control, and other industry scandals are designed to keep the money flowing. The jokers we pay to fix our stuff have no clue what they're doing, so they do a virus scan and then wipe out our precious photos. Intelligent, successful people feel intimidated by the chaos and think it's somehow their fault. If they only knew what the industry was doing to them, they'd get torches and pitchforks. If only we had someone to explain it all in plain English so we can start protecting ourselves. Oh wait, we do! It's the Computer Exorcist Podcast with your host, Mark Anthony Arena.
From the Wallace Memorial microphone in my living room, overlooking the can of worms in downtown Rochester, New York, this is the Computer Exorcist Podcast. My name is Mark Anthony Arena. We are finishing our conversation today with Steve, the Anecdotal Engineer. Hope y'all are enjoying getting to know him. Certainly check out the first episode before you go into this second episode. So that you know what we're talking about. But in a basic review, we talked to Steve and his very varied skills. He's a philosopher and an actor and a writer and an engineer, and you do all sorts of stuff. And a guy who takes walks with Mark all the time. and all that. And just so glad to know him. So, we talked about what is RAM, and he gave us a good explanation of that. RAM, also known as memory. We talked about a processor. He gave me the greatest explanation I've ever had of that. And we talked about how you make them. So, today I want to ask you, there are a few types of processors. What are they?
So, in the current day, we can largely talk about three. Two are relatively stable. One is relatively new. The first two are the CPU, the central processing unit, and the GPU, the graphics processing unit.
So what we talked about before is, we gave the analogy of the processor being like you, right? The person who does all the actions with all the stuff, right? If you're doing arts and crafts, you're the ones doing the action to the arts and crafts. So your processor does the activity.
Yes.
So a CPU, I usually equate it to an all-purpose device, right? It can do any kind of math for whatever you need. It's the central one. It's the one that does almost anything. Whereas the graphics processor unit just focuses on graphics. So it's a specialist, so to speak. It just does graphics. And our buddy Phil explained to me years ago that the GPU, because it's such a good specialist, it doesn't necessarily have to work on graphics. You can give it other tasks, such as dudes who are involved in Bitcoin mining. They use a GPU because it's good. It's a specialist at just doing a task. I'm a specialist, right? I just go into a place, I say the same 19 sentences every day, I do the same activities for people, I rescue people's data from OneDrive, I rip out OneDrive, I do a proper backup, I complain about Spectrum, I look at their Spectrum bill, I chop their Spectrum bill, I complain about all these things, and I do the same exact routine every day. I tell people not to worry, and blah, blah, blah. So I guess I would be like a GPU. Yeah, because I just do, and I kind of like it when I'm good at my job, but as you well know, I'm terrible at everything else. You ask me to cook something or clean my bathroom, and it's like, oh, that's different. I'd have to retool my mind. So I'd have to get into that mindset. I don't want to do that, right?
That's a pretty good way to put it.
He laughs because he knows it's true.
It's true in a loving friend way. It's one of those things that's an endearing quality at this point.
At this point.
So if you look at the CPU versus the GPU, yes, the CPU, a good way to put it would be to say a jack of all trades, a master of none. It is
Perfect.
Your thing that will do basically whatever you want. Even if it's very inefficient or very slow, it will always find a way to do so.
I like that.
The GPU is, if you think about an athlete maybe, this is a guy or a girl that runs the 100 meters and that is it. They don't do hurdles, they don't do long jump, they don't do high jump. They literally just run 100 meters and that's it. So they are,
and they're good at that. And luckily for them,
yes,
Wheaties and Fruit Loops are willing to pay them.
Exactly. Yes. So the GPU is highly specialized, highly trained, does some things really well, but you may not always be able to hand off tasks that Mark Anthony can do to one of those sprinters. So in general, CPU is your general purpose one, GPU is your specialist.
Perfect. So, what are the styles or architectures of processors? The official term is architecture. I just use the user-friendly word of style. So, if you were an Apple fan back in the 80s, those Apple computers ran on Motorola-style processors, right? Motorola architecture, where the CPU was made by Motorola and designed by Motorola, and they called it 68K, if you've heard of that. A buddy of mine is part of a club called 68K Liberation Army, where they look for old Macs on the side of the road, and they take them in and clean them and feed them, and they nurse them back to health. Then, later on, Apple and IBM used something called PowerPC. That's an IBM processor, right? So again, it's their design and their language, right? It's their architecture. So the programmers had to make programs for that architecture. Then later on, they went toward the Intel/AMD architecture. And at this point, as of 2018-19, they are now on something called the ARM architecture. I bought some stock in ARM, full disclosure, because a lot of stuff is going toward that. Whether or not you know it, your smartphone runs on ARM architecture. So the industry is moving toward that. That's architecture. And again, it's just that style, that design. It's not the end of the world. In this case, unfortunately, a lot of things in my industry are winner take all, right? Where these companies start up aiming to become a monopoly, or they aim to become the dominant architecture. So a lot of time, basically most of humanity for the past, let's say 30 years, since the early 90s, has been in an Intel AMD architecture world, right? All your PCs have been based on a style that Intel and AMD kind of sort of co-develop.
Yeah, so if you want to talk about how it looks right now, the Motorola 68K, which was, state-of-the-art back when it became a thing. And
in the 80s?
70s into the 80s, late 70s. One of the places I work still has functional 68K processors running some HP controllers. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah, it's like walking into a museum and it's still functioning.
Oh, how cool.
It's glorious.
And unlike modern computers, they don't get update attacks that screw up all our airlines like we just saw this month.
So if you think about those things, things from the 70s and the 80s, it's probably the closest to say that's kind of like an Arduino. It's kind of a specific processor that doesn't have a whole lot of memory, has some ability to hold code on it, has whatever function set it does, and will do something for you on a relatively limited basis. That's probably a good way to put it.
Well said, yep.
If you look at the Intel/AMD, that is what they call x86 Genesis, which was 32-bit processing. That's for your general purpose computers. So if you happen to be on a Lenovo, on a Chromebook.
So if you're on a normal Lenovo or Dell or HP, right, so from 06 to 2018, the Apples ran on the Intel stuff.
Yes. Yeah. So again, timelines for me are very difficult, but Mark being the specialist that he is, he knows exactly where the delineation is.
And I was horrible at dates in history class in school. But I'm good at dates when it comes to stuff that's really, immediately consequential to my job. I care about history.
So say personal computers from, the mid 2000s into the mid to late 2010s. All that was the x86 architecture, which has eventually been supplanted by 64-bit from 32-bit, allows for larger registers, lets you do more cool things with big numbers. We'll leave it at that for the simplification.
Perfect. Yeah, so if you're wondering why we went from 32 to 64, Steve just said it best. Allows you to do things with big numbers.
Exactly. And then the ARM bits, which are your current iPads, which are your current day cell phones, whether or not you are a Android or an Apple ecosystem fan. These are the ones that have what we call a reduced instruction set. So it's not to say that they're not as capable as these computers, but they have something that allows them to do an action in a very set amount of time. So a PC, personal computer, if you give it a task, it might take a certain number of what they call clock cycles, which is, just basically the smallest unit of individual action that it can take.
So it's like, how much work can I do in a day? How's that?
Yeah, but maybe call it a second. Like you have an 8-hour day, the second is functionally the smallest piece of time that you can do anything in.
How much can we do during that
during that
second?
1 second? Yes. Yeah. So that's kind of what it is for the computers in between their clock ticks. So
the speed of a computer is measured that way. Like, what can I do in a second? Same. All right. So side note here, like, how long does it take you to balance your checkbook? Okay, it takes people, let's say, 10 minutes. And how long does it take your calculator? Okay, it might take a minute, let's just say. But a computer nowadays, a modern Intel computer, can do, let's just say 4 billion mathematical operations per second.
That might be a little generous.
But the idea, you get the point. Yeah,
the scale is really where it happens. So what we can do as humans with our electrochemical brain and synapses, compare that to what a pocket calculator can do. Compare that to your personal computer. Compare that to graphics clusters and supercomputers and all that kind of stuff, and you kind of have a sense of how many operations and how many actions you can take at whatever your unit of smallest measure is. Mm-hmm. It's probably a good way to represent it.
So, Apple moved over to the ARM architecture. Number one, so that they no longer have to buy processors from Intel, right? Those are one of the more expensive components. If you go build your own computer tomorrow, component by component, the processor itself, if you're is usually going to be one of the most expensive parts. So Apple said, why don't we just design our own? At this point, I think they can afford it to design something on their own, and they don't have to outsource it. Okay, fine. So they said, we're going to go with the ARM architecture. Okay. So they are building, they're their own chips in their own facilities, their own manufacturing facilities. So they make them.
Yep.
But it's ARM's design.
Exactly.
Right. So years ago, IBM with the PowerPC, they made them, they designed them, right?
Yep.
So in this case, Apple says we're going to take ARM's design and we're going to use that blueprint, that design from ARM in our own factories. Okay, great. You know what's interesting, and I come up with a simple way to put this, but so these modern Apple computers are expected to run the older software because, by golly, there's plenty of software out there that we still need to use that was based on the old architecture. Okay. So Apple calls it Rosetta, which I think is cool, right? It's like the Rosetta Stone had the languages on it, so it translates it. So I think that's cool imagery. And so it's a way for these newer processors to run software meant for an older architecture. Okay. So why are these new Apple processors so fast, even when they're using Rosetta and doing their little high school Spanish homework and doing the translations, right?
Yes.
And by the way, folks, this is the question I asked him at breakfast last fall, at that very early morning breakfast. So he came up with just an incredible explanation. So why are these new processors so darn fast?
So the Apple M chips, the interesting thing they do is related to the hardware of the chip. So normally when you have a computer, it has RAM that is not on the same part of the computer, that processor, that chip, They also call it the die. So there's different words for it that mean different things as you get down into the layers of what's going on under the hood. But broadly speaking, RAM was something that was on the motherboard, and the chip is plugged into the motherboard, and then there's all these pathways from the chip to the RAM, and you have however many gigabytes of RAM in the modern day, and the processor would have to send information back and forth to off the chip, but still on the motherboard RAM. And
so it took a little while for the electrons to go back and forth.
Yes.
I mean, it adds up, right?
It adds up. So electrons move at 2/3 the speed of light as a rough approximation. And that means that you can only go so far in that amount of time. It's not, infinitely quick. Like we have speed limits that we follow on the roads. Electrons have speed limits that they follow inside of their traces between the CPU and the RAM.
Yeah.
So the farther away that RAM is, the longer the out and back trip.
And especially if it's making multiple trips. That's
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if we go back to our analogy we were talking about last time, where we were working with tiles and we said, hey, we have our craft room. The craft room is, like maybe that's memory that's right on the chip, like cache.
Versus going off on a shelf where, yes, it's still in-house. You don't have to go all the way to the store.
Yep.
But it's like, oh, gosh, if you're doing arts and crafts on your table and you have to keep getting up, walking over to your shelf, coming back to your seat, right?
Or
it's convenient.
Let's
it's okay, garage, fine.
The garage is just next to your house, and your house is where you've got your craft studio.
So it's not terrible. It's fine. It's somewhat convenient, right?
Yes.
So that's the analogy with traditional computers. The RAM is local. It's on the motherboard, but it does take you a little bit to get up and walk to the garage and come back, right?
Yep. So
what did they do?
We forgot to touch on cache being something that was very local for very quick memory needs to use for the process.
Okay, so let's call your actual table the cache, where it's right in front of you.
Within 3 feet. You can reach it within 3 feet.
Yeah, just something in front of you within arm's reach.
Yes.
Okay, so what you're telling me is that Apple looked at that and said, hey, our processors have to keep getting up and walking over to the garage in order to get things. Is that right?
So they looked at the RAM being on the motherboard. They did not like that. They asked themselves, can we speed things up? So, if you only have to go back and forth to your garage one time a day, it's not worth it for you to move all that stuff in your garage into an adjacent room in your house, or even into the room where you'd be doing your crafts. But if you get up and you go hundreds of thousands of times a minute back and forth to your garage,
that processor needs to access the RAM thousands of times a minute.
That time crunch of going back and forth, that round trip, really slows down your computing if you look at the long time frames.
Because again, it adds up, right?
Yes.
It's all about the adds up. If it happens once, no big deal. It's a millisecond, but it's all day, thousands of times. It needs to do that activity all day. So again, what if you were going to your garage 1,000 times a day?
Yep. So what they did is they changed how their CPU was set up, and it would be the equivalent of basically putting shelves in the entire craft room, and all you have is shelves in the entire craft room of all the things you might need 6 inches apart between the shelves. So you now have huge amounts of storage. You have all these tiles available to you for your craft needs, and they are right there. If they're not within 3 feet, maybe they're within 10 feet. So the distance you travel is no longer 50 feet to go to your garage and back again. It's 10 feet or less. So it's 5 times faster, roughly speaking, in the examples we're talking about.
Just by making it closer, within arm's reach, instead of walking to the garage. Oh, wait a minute. Now we're going to save massive amounts of time.
Yes.
And Apple loves those little multipliers during the conferences when they announce the new products. It's always 5 times faster and 2 times faster and 3 times faster. For as long as I can remember, past 20 years watching their little conferences, it's always 2 times faster, 6 times faster. Okay. Yep. So that's how they achieved it. Unfortunately, what that means is that you're no longer allowed to upgrade the RAM. That's the huge drawback. So yes, it's wicked fast, but 3-4 years from now, because software programmers make software that's more and more and more and more ultra bloated by the day, a couple of years from now, that wicked fast processor that's still perfectly fine, the processor doesn't degrade, it doesn't physically crumble, it's still fast, it's just that the new software out there is more ultra bloated and it's more like molasses. So anyway, 3 years from now, you're not allowed to upgrade that computer. You put it in the garbage or hopefully recycle.
Yes.
That still does not. Yeah, so that's the deal. Hopefully, they'll come up with some way to maybe upgrade the RAM, still, the one that's built into the processor, but I doubt it because people are evil and that's why we can't have good things, as they say. So that's why we can't have nice things. But there is still no excuse whatsoever for Apple integrating the hard drive into the motherboard. That's pure evil. 99% of people don't have backup. So if you have a modern Mac built around after 2019, your data is on there, and if your hard drive or motherboard corrupt themselves, if your motherboard breaks, it's all one board. Normally, I pluck the hard drive out and I rescue your data. But if it's part of the board and the motherboard corrupts itself, you are roasted forever. There's only one man in the world named Louis Rossmann who can rescue your stuff. So no excuse whatsoever for the integrated hard drive, but at least the RAM kind of makes sense.
Well, curiously, if you think about the same argument we were making for the RAM about how far you have to walk,
yeah,
every time you have a connector, which is, what they have for hard disks, or if you happen to have a solid state drive,
any kind of hard drive,
you have a standard connector that you plug into. Yes,
sure. So the removable hard drive plugs into a connector. Yeah.
So you end up having to take all of your connections between your CPU and that drive, and you have to fan them out into something that's human sized
to connect it.
So now you have to add distance to how far those electrons have to go back and forth between. And when you add distance, you're now slowing things down. So if you want super fast read and write also to your local drive,
so you kind of do need to integrate
it. You get rid of
it.
these human-sized connectors and you make it as close as you need to, and then you just have a solder connection. So the argument still holds up. It's just...
interesting. So that's their excuse. Right. Yes. Oh, I like that. All right, so number one, that's their engineer's excuse. All right, so at least you help us understand the madness behind it. But you're okay, so you're saying, absolutely, I love how you put that. It's opposed to my world.
Yes.
It's opposed to humanity. It's against humanity. They do not like you folks. And it's just, so they're, in that case, they're saving a little fraction of a second of time, right? But they're screwing over the whole world because most people have no backups. And again, a few years from now is when people are going to notice this, when their Mac breaks and they come to me and say, what do you mean you can't rescue my data? You always rescue my data, Mark. You pluck my hard drive out and you rescue my data. And I'm going to say, sorry, too bad. You were duped into Apple. You were duped by Apple into buying a product with an integrated hard drive.
So the question then becomes, what does Apple offer as a backup service?
So they offer the iCloud scandal, which is a backup that forces and sucks all your data without your knowledge. Or you can use a real thing like I recommend. Number one, if you have an Apple product, use an external hard drive to store anything you care about. So if and when that thing dies, I can pluck out that little external thumb drive or external hard drive, whatever. But also you can do real proper backup. If you go to my website, thecomputerexorcist.com, on my recommendations page, I recommend iDrive. Anything that's not Apple, Microsoft, or Carbonite is what I recommend. But yeah, if you go to my recommendations page, there's a thing for iDrive, and they give me like a $1 every quarter or something if you sign up. So full disclosure. Now I get the peanut gallery right in front of me. It's like, I wonder if people are laughing as they listen to the show. Now I know.
Just a little bit here and there.
So that's that. What we'll do is this. We'll wrap up here, and then we'll come back next week, and I will read an article, and I'll get Steve's opinion. What do you say?
Sounds delightful.
All right. Thanks so much for being here, folks. thecomputerexorcist.com. Talk to you next week.
It's all right now. Make it on my own. I paid my time and my dues, and now I'm coming home. First they give you an inch, and then they take